welcome back. Let's start a discussion and we'll focus on the supply chain and CO2 emissions in the region of Asia Pacific. And for this, we have a wonderful panel and panelists from Asia actually standing by joining us from Asia. And I'd like to start by introducing them first. I'd like to welcome Emi Matsukawa. She works with the CDP in Tokyo, Japan, as an advisor to Japanese companies and financial institutions in relation to their sustainability reporting. And the Carbon Disclosure Project supports companies and cities to disclose their environmental impact and aims to make environmental reporting and risk management a business norm to build a thriving economy that works for people and the planet in the long term. Welcome, Amy. Good to have you.
Thank you.
And from India, we're very happy to welcome the Director General of the Energy and Resources Institute and member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, Ajay Mathur. He has been a key Indian climate change negotiator and was also the Indian spokesperson at the 2015 climate negotiations in Paris. Headquartered in New Delhi with regional centers across the country, TERI is an independent, multidimensional organization focusing on promoting efficient use of resources and reducing the impact on the environment and climate. Welcome, Ajay.
Pleasure to be here.
And then we have the director of the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, an international multi-stakeholder voluntary membership organization with a mission to lead improvements in the socioeconomic and environmental performance of the natural rubber value chain. Members of the platform include producers, processors, and traders, tire makers, and other rubber makers and buyers, car makers, other downstream users, and financial institutions in civil society. Welcome, Stefano Savi. Good to have you, Stefano.
Hi. Hi, Martin. Thank you for having me.
And of course, we have our resident BMW experts here at BMW, and I'd like to introduce them also. First is Nicole Funk. She is expert direct procurement.
Good Hello morning. Together.
Hi. And then we have, and you might have seen him before because he just did the interview with Alyssa Ralf Hattler. He's the head of indirect goods and services, raw materials and production partners.
Good morning, everybody.
And Dr. Thomas Becker, Vice President of Sustainability and Mobility.
Good morning.
Hello, Thomas. And once again, please use our chat function. We have a chat team standing by. I just want to say hello to Friedi. Hi, Friedi. Good to have you. He will take your questions and then they will hand them to me so I can ask the panel, and we'll try to get as many of your questions answered as possible. Now, I want to start with a question from a market research and ask our experts in Asia what they think about the results. The question was, how important is a sustainable supply chain to you when it comes to buying a product? And the results were quite impressive. 56% said it's very important, and 19% it's important. So we have almost 80% people saying it's actually a very important factor when they buy a product. So what I would like to know is, would you have expected this kind of result? Amy, maybe, would you want to comment on this? Maybe she cannot hear me. So, Stefano, did you see the result? Is that something that you would have expected, that people actually consider, 80% consider the these implications when they buy a product?
Sure. I think it's very comforting to see the response from the public, on the issues around sustainability and supply chains, and how these are so important for their purchasing decisions. I do think that why this is telling, it's always difficult from market research to understand how consumers are actually responding then with their purchasing power, and not just with their opinions on this. So that's a critical point, and I think it's important for companies to understand that while following market trends is important, it's also important for companies, especially when we talk about sustainability, to lead and be in front of consumers and guiding consumers on the right choices. So that's a comment that I would have on the research.
Ajay, would you think that's also true for Indian consumers?
The quick answer is yes. A couple of years ago, the Council for Business Sustainability, which Terry facilitates, it's a group of uh, companies across various sectors, and all of them are committed to pushing sustainable development by their own actions. They had carried out a survey of the supply chain managers in a very large number of industries. Remember, these are industries and not consumers. To find out if they did any kind of green risk assessment, particularly climate change, but larger green risk assessment when they looked at the supply chain. And 68% said that they did. Now, at that point of time, this number did surprise us because, 2 or 3 years ago, we didn't think that within the corporate sector, we will see that many people who are concerned about their supply chain. But it seems that the concerns about the longevity and the ability of the supply chains to continue to deliver on their products was something that weighed on the minds of the supply chain managers.
And Amy, I would also like to ask you, since you're back now, were you surprised that a sustainable supply chain is so important to consumers? Would you think that's also true for Japanese consumers?
Yes, I'm very sorry, but I was out for a moment, so but I'm back safely. So sorry, but my heart stopped when my connection is disconnected. So now
Good to have you
safe.
back.
Yes, sorry. And hearing the result of the market research, it is not surprising for me, but more than I expected. But in Japanese market, I guess there's people are concerning about sustainability still at this moment. But now the awareness is increasing for these years, couple of years, because of the damage of the natural disaster, like a large typhoon attacked to Japan.
Thank you. So that's pretty positive. I mean, we see that the awareness is increasing, and a lot of people think about the supply chain when they buy a product. Now, what are BMW's groups when it comes to a sustainable supply chain? What do you have planned?
So first of all, I think it's interesting to see that the customer wants it, but we at BMW we also clearly committed ourselves to make our our supply chain much more sustainable. As I mentioned in the introduction, we have to avoid on the one side the increase by electrification of 30% per vehicle. We want to reduce 20% of the CO2 emission in our supply chain. So that's a tremendous target we gave ourselves. So I think it's very important because it's our task to make a better CO2 emission worldwide. So therefore, I appreciate that we have this discussion today and yesterday with the whole world, because our supplier base is distributed around the globe and we have to find solutions wherever they are sitting. And for example, we have to look much more in reusable energy solutions, specifically in the raw material area. Aluminium, steel, but also in the cobalt and lithium, what I mentioned, because we have to lower the emission specifically in this area. On the other side, we want to discuss with all our suppliers solutions they have, because it's not just our task to bring the supply chain down. It's the task of the whole supply chain, of all elements of the supply chain, and not just of the suppliers, also of the transportation industry. So we have to bring these guys together and find the right solutions.
So quite ambitious goals. Amy, let me ask you, now that we hear that BMW Group has really ambitious goals, what are, like from the CDP standpoint, what are your expectations and what do you see as the biggest issues that BMW Group is facing?
Thank you for asking. I'm in charge of CDP program. Through this program, investors in capital markets can request companies to disclose environmental data and information. And we have currently 515 global institutional investors that have signed up to CDP. In terms of how investors evaluate companies, I've seen an increase of focus in broader boundaries and the scope of responsibility, especially in the last few years. Corporate disclosure has improved considerably, but investors, especially long-term asset owners, such as pension funds and insurance companies, are realizing that the SDGs and ESG issues will not be solved by the effort of individual company alone, but rather it may make issues worse by negative externality. I'd like to mention two important things for companies' response, like BMW. The first one is to take action, practical and immediately. And the second is collaboration in the supply chain. As I told, CDP provides a mechanism for investors to request climate change, water security, and forest disclosures from companies. And from the result, CDP evaluates and scores companies' response. Among the questionnaire, supply chain engagement is one of the important modules within the criteria. As a result, supply chain program launched 10 years ago so that companies can require their own suppliers to disclose GHG emissions and other data. And in this year, 155 companies around the world joined this program, including BMW. I believe that the system for collaborating on actions to reduce CO2 emissions in the relationship with the supply chain being established here is complete between members' reduction and the suppliers' reduction as well. Furthermore, the now Paris Agreement has started. Companies are trying to improve their CO2 reduction targets from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. If 1.5 or net zero is to be set as a target, according to science-based target, then reduction in scope 3, it is emission from the supply chain, are really crucial. So now BMW has committed to many initiatives to set the ambitious goal. So I'm very looking forward to their result.
Thank you, Amy. So it sounds almost like a compliment. I mean, it's important to take action, to collaborate. Ajay, would you agree with that statement? How do you see BMW's goals, and what do you see also specific to your region is important? Is it about taking action? Is it about collaborating?
We had looked at the automobile industry in India, and one of the key things that came out was obviously using renewable energy is important. But the second thing which is important is the ability to be sustainable is recycling and the ability to set up specifications so that material can be taken out in a manner so that it is quote unquote dismantleable and therefore recyclable. And wonder what are the steps that BMW has taken to help its supply chain provide products so that they are dismantleable and therefore recyclable, and help the supply chain in using more and more renewable energy.
Okay.
Uh,
Just let me step into
yes,
that.
absolutely.
We do a lot of activities concerning recycling, especially if you look at metals. We integrated closed loop processes in our own production plants, and we will roll out that to all our production plants all over the world. We are facing with challenges in the different markets with the ability to recycle, the availability of suppliers over there, and as well as you told, the dismantling challenge, where we have a recycling center here at Munich, where we try or where we make research on this topic, because this is very important to bring all these material back to the loops. The customer can provide this as well, but I think it's a challenge for us to bring the cars back to the cycle, especially if we talk about battery cells. There we do a lot of research, but currently not enough batteries are available. So we do research activities, and we always also integrated that point in our development process. We are starting with a kind of design for recycling to have a look on these aspects, how we are able to integrate in the future at the end of the life or end of life for our products, to integrate it back in our production loop.
Thomas, now these are very specific measures, and we heard about recycling before, renewable energy. How do these measures fit into the overall sustainability strategy at BMW Group? And how are your plans of making the sustainable supply chain the best supply chain in the industry?
Well, very clearly, we stick since years to the standards of the Carbon Disclosure Project. And what we do here is really to analyze very properly where the CO2 footprint comes from. And if you look at the targets we have been deciding this summer, it means getting down the footprint in the supply chain by 20%, as Ralph said, but we will also reduce the footprint of our own production by another 80%. And what we can't do ourselves on time, we will compensate properly. So we will have a CO2 neutral production at BMW from next year onwards. But the third pillar, obviously, is the usage of our cars. And here until 2030, we want to get down by 40% on a global average. So it's relatively easy to say, I want to be totally carbon neutral by 2040 or 2050. That's a commitment for, let's say, the successors of our successors. But what we have been doing is we set ourselves a firm commitment for 2030, which is in line with the Paris Agreement and with obviously also the many pieces of legislation we have in many countries in the US, in California, in Europe, and in very many of our Asian markets, with whom we will obviously seek to fully comply or even outperform, as we will with the European targets this year. So if I'm speaking about a commitment, it's very clear that a second important pillar is the way how we set ourselves targets, how we measure them, and how we communicate them. So another thing that has been decided by the Board of Management in July was that we will set ourselves new targets for 2030 on those three categories. And these will go into the measurement of management's performance and thereby also into our pay. And secondly, we will be the first company in the automotive industry that goes for integrated reporting. So last year, we have been producing the last sustainability report of the BMW Group, because from next year onwards, there will be only one comprehensive report that will integrate sustainability fully into our overall reporting and our target achievement measurements, including having third-party certification of the most important indicators relevant for sustainability in general, and namely climate change in particular.
And we talked about this yesterday when we talked about the holistic approach, when we talked about the region of the Americas. Now, Stefano, let me ask you, would you compliment BMW Group on these very ambitious goals, on this commitment, or do you think it's not enough, they should do more? How do you see that specifically for the region of Asia Pacific?
Thank you, Martin. That's a very good question, and brings up a point that I wanted to raise. I think it's great to see that BMW is doing this much work as a company and really moving the bar for targets on sustainability and ways to look at sustainability in integrating it within the company's values. This said, one thing that I would raise is that a sustainability leader in a failing sector is not a leader anymore. And this is really what we need to look at in the future. And it's important for companies to understand that they really play a role in moving the bottom of the sector, the worst performing companies, to become better and not allow others to benefit from the possibility of having leakage markets for example, deforestation or worse carbon emissions, and become leaders in markets that, for example, today don't yet demand sustainability, or sectors or sections of the market that don't demand sustainability. I think this said that we've seen BMW also taking a lead on this. I'll take the example of our organization, the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber. We have a vision for a fair, equitable, and environmentally sound natural rubber value chain. And it's great that in the last 2 years of work, where BMW is one of our members, also members of the executive committee of the organization, has taken a role in moving now 50% of the global volume of natural rubber under strong no deforestation, no exploitation policies that we will see implemented by the platform members. So I think this is going to be the next most important challenge for companies: how to take this as not only as a company challenge, but as a sector challenge, and making sure that we include more and more companies that are not yet talking about sustainability into these discussions, because we cannot just look at the tip of the iceberg and compliment companies that are doing well. If we don't look at the bottom of it, it's not going to go forward. Yeah, this sustainability is a global challenge and requires global solutions, not company solutions.
Very important aspect. And Ralf, I know you want to talk about it, but first, let's just look at another market research question, because it's very fitting when we talk about industry leaders. And we asked the question of how do you evaluate car manufacturers on a scale from 1 to 5 for the most sustainable supply chain? And people said, well, I would. No, that's not the one. I was talking about the one where people rated car manufacturers on a scale from 1 to 5 for the most sustainable supply chain, and they said I would rate BMW Group as, that's the one, here we see it, 95% said fair, and only 26% said good. So, well, this sort of takes me to the question of, yes, Stefano said, well, I mean, you need to be sort of a lighthouse where people want to follow, but also get others to have the same standards that you have, and maybe then also change people's perception.
Yeah, I think the answer of Stefano was great, and I would like to comment in combination with this chart. First of all, for us, it's very important that we get the transparency of the supply chain. Yeah, that's a huge challenge, as you can imagine. Then we have to define the main tackle points, basically, the worst cases and the most development areas we have to look at. But important is, and that is a change of philosophy. So far, our selection criteria for suppliers was quality, cost, and the flexibility for production. We added a fourth element, and that's the sustainability. So in future, it's not just price and quality. It has to be there, but it's the sustainable solutions the supplier will offer to us. Yeah, where can they contribute? What do they change? Yeah, so they have to offer us, beside the price, also solutions. And I think that is our approach to bring this whole CO2 discussion in a common discussion in the whole supply chain. Yeah, and certainly we will decide case by case. Maybe the better CO2 solution will win a tender process, yeah, and this kind of science we have to give into the supply chain and fight the right direction. And if we won't change this world from today to tomorrow. So therefore, Thomas talked about the plan until 2013, and I'm quite happy that we also have a clear match plan, we call it, for in the supply chain until 2013. We know exactly what we want to do in the next 10 years, and that's very ambitious, and therefore we really want to accelerate this whole thing, and therefore we integrated the whole sustainability in our tendering process and decision process. And maybe that's new in the automotive industry, and hopefully it works.
So another award criteria. I just want to know, Stefano, how do you think can you get the partners in the supply chain, the suppliers, to work with you? I mean, we have the carrot and we have the stick. How can it make economical sense also to the suppliers? I mean, naturally, everyone's interested in sustainability, but it needs to make economic sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, Martin, I think that's a great point. I think one of the issues that we face today is that, and we see it also in our legislation, for example, is that a key proposition for the consumers is to get the products at the cheapest price. Yeah, our antitrust regulation, for example, today is moving consumers towards that target. Yeah, and I think it's important that we understand how instead we can have a better, more holistic way of understanding the value of a product for a consumer. Yeah, and how we can allow companies to collaborate to make sure that that product is, yes, cheap for the consumer, but also doesn't create any negative unintended consequences for the consumer. Yeah, if it's cheaper, but you've lost a forest on the other side of the world, if you ask these consumers, they will probably tell you that that's not something that they would like to see. Yeah, and I think it's in this space that we need to try and find ways to start a discussion also about equity. Yeah, what is equity in our supply chains today? Where is it? We have 6 to 7 million farmers just in rubber, for example, that as of today are not making a living in many cases. Yeah, producing commodities that are then sold in the more affluent parts of the world. And a key challenge to this is competition, in a way, which is something that, of course, we need to protect by law, but we need to have also ways to understand how we can allow that competition to be a healthy competition for our systems and ecosystems. So I think this is where companies need to really come on board. And while, of course, collaborating according to the legislation, push to ensure that the legislation supports collaborative action, yeah, and understand how we can look at the future where maybe we can have a better and more equitable supply chain that will for sure allow us to have less unintended consequences on the environmental and social and economic externalities for those links of the supply chains that are weaker today.
Ajay, and I saw you nodding. Would you like to comment on this?
I think Stefano is right on the point. The issue always is the trade-off between the economics of the present and the benefits of the future. Thankfully, technologies and particularly economies of scale provide us a way out. And I'll give you an example. Uh, in India, we were looking at the penetration of electric vehicles, and they are much more expensive than fossil fuel based vehicles. And therefore, a company, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, aggregated demand over several consumers, particularly government consumers, and said, we will provide you with an electric vehicle at a price which is no more than that at which you rent fossil fuel vehicles. And then on the other side, they went and did a public procurement, a bulk procurement of electric vehicles at scale, which allowed companies, therefore, to invest in these facilities knowing that they have a large market. It brought prices down. I think it's the first step. I think they'll have to go on doing this. They've done this for other things in the past. They've done it for air conditioners, they've done it for LED bulbs and so on, and have been very successful. In other words, the ecosystem that is needed to help in the transition towards the more sustainable future and at the same time make that as the economically preferred future is something that each country will have to discover on its own.
May I add one thing, and I appreciate what you're saying. I personally convinced, we have to start now, but the suppliers and the supply chain elements who start to think about sustainability, they will have a competitive advantage very, very soon. Because, it's our common target. It's not a BMW target. We start now. But it will be very, very soon a competitive advantage in the tender process.
And we have
I completely agree with that, actually.
And we have a question.
And therefore, what is important is we need to build up volumes, because volumes is what will bring suppliers into the market, and more suppliers will move towards sustainable products. Apologies for butting in.
No worries. Absolutely, yes. And I want to ask a question that we received in our chat. And the question is, there are a lot of differences within countries and governments. Shouldn't there be contracts between the industry and the government to have common aims for CO2 emissions? You probably agree with that statement, right? I mean,
Well, I mean, one of the big challenges, namely if we talk about electric vehicles, is the framework conditions we are facing in the different markets. I mean, for 100 years, we had a situation where with one technology, with one product, with one kind of infrastructure, you could just do everything everywhere all the time. And with the shift to electric cars, this is changing fundamentally. We depend on the availability of public infrastructure. We see very clearly that those markets where we are most advanced with our electric vehicle shares are those where actually the government assists also in terms of taxation, for example, and where people perceive the electric mile being the cheaper mile. So this is about the relationship between electricity prices and fuel prices, something which is clearly out of our control. So that means that we are navigating in an environment where we have very different speeds of uptake of a new technology, and where we actually as a manufacturer need to work very closely with governments in order to ramp up that technology. And finally, and this adds complexity, it's not just national governments who make choices. It's up to cities to what extent they support the transition to alternative drivetrains. It's city council's decision where to put public charging infrastructure or where not to do it. And with that, obviously, the challenge for us to navigate in very different environments is part of what we need to be able to do in the coming years. And that's behind this 40% average. You have a range that goes from almost 0 to almost 100. And that's the future for the years to come.
And to answer this question for the supply chain, we need the cooperation with governments. And we learn a lot at the moment. Yeah, if we really want to use the renewable energy, yeah, it's totally different in Europe or in China or in America. And it's a huge change for these companies, for the steel producers, for the aluminium producers. We have to cooperate with governments, or they have to cooperate, and we have to all cooperate. Otherwise, we won't achieve this change.
And we have a second question. The question is, I wonder whether Southeast Asian markets are too small for brand-specific recycling to be economic. Personally, I would doubt that this is the case because they're not specifically small. You want to comment on this, Nicole?
Yes. Yes, it's
because you talked about recycling before. So it is already going on.
Yeah, but I have to say we have to face with several challenges in different markets. Where you have established recycling culture, it's much more easier to bring it back to the loops. In Asia, we have a lot of our raw material producers where we buy the raw material, and you have a lot of, let me say, scrap or material out of production, end of life, where they collect it. But currently, I guess AJ will agree with me, it's a challenge to bring it back to the loops and bring it back to the manufacturers to make out of them new material. And this is really a strategy we have to focus on in the future and to go on this topic specific in Asia to start or integrate recycling processes and closed loops.
Ajay, would you think that's specifically true for India when it comes to integrated and closed loops processes?
I think Nicole is absolutely right. There is an issue as far as the collection of the used material, the used car is concerned, then the collection of the recycled material after it has been dismantled is concerned. And if it is brand specific, it means that the amount of sales that they have in a particular country has to be large enough to justify both the collection and the recycling. Now, this BMW will know what are the relative economics of setting up the collection and recycling system, and whether it makes sense into their overall chain, or whether it is better to collaborate across various brands and see whether that makes a difference. My own feeling is that this is going to be country specific. There are, unfortunately, a lot of rules regarding the trading of waste materials. One of the things I think we need to move towards is providing a exemption for the trading of recycled materials or recyclable materials, so that it becomes much easier to then aggregate multiple countries into one recycling zone. I think it talks to us about the challenges. There are both historical challenges in countries as well as these challenges in international collaboration which need to be overcome.
Amy, the automotive industry is very specific, and the CDP obviously works with many different industries. Where do you see the main differences between the challenges that the car manufacturers and the supply chain in automotive is facing, as opposed to other industries when it comes to the supply chain?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, yes. According to CDP's analysis report, among total CO2 emission from the one company, supply chain accounts for more than 5 times of its own scope 1 and 2. This is an industry average figure, but as you mentioned the ratio before, what percent of the portion is from scope 3? 6 times or 7 times. So this means the ambitious target in automotive industry will not be met without working with supply chain to make scope 3 reduction. This is a characteristic aspect of automotive industry, I think.
Yes, and thank you very much, Amy. Maybe we have to clarify this a little bit for our viewers. We talked about scope 1, 2, 3. Scope 1 are the direct emissions that are coming from owned or controlled sources. Scope 2, indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating, cooling, consumed by the reporting company. And scope 3, all other indirect emissions. So I mean, there's only so many things you can actually control. I mean, tier 1 level, BMW Group already has around 12,000 suppliers, and then it goes down. So how do you control this aspect of the supply chain when it comes to CO2?
That's exactly the very crucial question, because I think we have a clear transparency about our first-tier suppliers. Yeah? But the biggest impact of CO2 is not, in production of a seat or a cockpit. It's more down the supply chain, yeah, at the mines, at aluminium, at steel, at the raw material. And this is something totally new for us. Yeah, we have to find the transparency really across the whole supply chain and tackle basically the energy-intensive production processes. And this is actually the big challenge we have. And therefore we are in close contact with strategy meetings, with steel producers, with aluminium. I mentioned the cobalt, I mentioned the lithium. So we really went down very deep into the supply chain and tried to find solutions together with these companies, because that's the biggest impact. And Thomas mentioned this 10-year plan until 2013. So it's a huge elephant. We have to cut them in slices, yeah. And the first slice is basically really the high intensive energy production processes, and that's exactly what I just tried to explain.
So different supplies, different tiers, different chances to actually have an impact on CO2 emissions. Ajay, where do you see this for specifically for the region of India or even Asia Pacific? Which suppliers do you think have the most potential in your region?
Okay. There are multiple suppliers, but I think in the immediate future, these suppliers who use electricity for production are the first people who will make the difference. This is actually all the metal forming, all the electricals, but the large amount of energy that is used, for example, in the foundries that produce the engines, I think that will be a second step. So as we move ahead, we will see a progression. It's not going to happen one day suddenly that it happens. As we look at the progression, we will also see standard operating procedures coming out for this. The problem is, as was mentioned earlier, we are moving from a system where you had a very well established technology for 100 years. It was used across the world. The requirements were well known. And people went in, and there were enough people around. So when people invested in this, there were skilled people who you could get. In a transition, that becomes difficult. because in a sense, you're working with each supplier, you're working with each country, and you feel, oh my God, look at the number of decisions we have to take. That is both the problem and the benefit of being the first mover. Because you are, in a sense, setting up the standard operating protocols which all others will follow after you. So, Martin, it is a challenge. And it is I don't want to get this wrong, but the good point is that it also becomes the template for the future.
And what would specifically be your expectation from BMW Group for the future? Make a short wish list.
The BMW Group has been excellent at providing the kinds of leadership, skills training, and technology templates, for the lack of a better word, which help in this transition. So as they work with their suppliers, it would be great if those kinds of templates, you don't have to provide details that are very specific to the company and could provide and could lead to BMW losing its competitive edge. But those things that can help in collaboration, writing them down, putting them up as standard operating practices so that other people don't have to reinvent the entire wheel, but only have to make that little rim on top so that they kind of tweak it for their own use. This is what BMW has been good at, and I look forward to BMW providing the kind of leadership that is needed for specifications, for sourcing of materials, for the kinds of testing that is done, and for the kinds of skills that are needed for the large-scale replication of sustainability across the supply chain.
Amy, what's on your wish list?
My wish list for BMW.
Yes.
BMW has been a very luxury brand of car, and I longed for owning a BMW in the future when I was young, and I used M technology series many years ago. So, and now still BMW is very popular here in Japan. But now awareness of climate crisis is rapidly increasing among individuals in Japan. So we got physical damage by a typhoon. So the people's way of thinking about environment has been changed rapidly. So, and the automotive industries and the usage of car itself has a heavy impact to environment. So people feel the importance of users' choice, and the choice is necessary to be affordable for many people. So I hope that as BMW, as a leadership in automotive industry, standing responsible position to create a better future of mobility that can reduce the negative impact to environment and also other elements of SDGs. I want to see how BMW can respond and make a just transition for creating the sustainable society together with consumer. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Stefano, what are you expecting? What are you hoping for?
That's a very good question. Thank you for the opportunity. I think I have maybe 3 thoughts that I'd like to share on this. The first one is invest in new sustainability market. Don't just look where the sustainability market is already present, but open new market for sustainability. I think we need a global sustainability market if we want to have global sustainability solutions. That's the first one. The second one is don't just look at BMW, look at your peers and bring more peers under the collaborative efforts that are already existing and working. The Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber is one. We have 5 automotive members today. We need many more if we want to make a dent and have that pull on the supply chain. Yeah, it's a chain, it can only be pulled, it cannot be pushed. And the third one, I would say, is be different in communication if you can in the future, and don't be afraid of talking about failures. A lot of companies are worried about talking of failure and where have we failed, but that's how we can make other companies learn. And if we won't see from the leaders that you have failed and you managed to stand back up, the other companies will not follow because they are too afraid and don't have the means or the enough big shoulders to think that they're going to survive. So talk about failure, and we will get there.
We will get there, Ralf.
Thank you very much. I really like your wish list. It's ambitious, but exactly that's what we're discussing. Because I talked about the match plan for the next 10 years. We know we will fail. Yeah, we have good ideas. Maybe they never materialize. Yeah, then we have to find other ideas. And I think that is exactly what we have to do. And we want to have a clear leadership in reduction of CO2 in the supply chain. But leadership means we are not alone. We need others. Yeah, we need the quantity in the supply chain. But we want to step faster. We want to run faster, and we want to take over the leadership. And we know we will make failures. And I promise you, we will talk about these because we learn out of mistakes.
Thomas, would you like to comment on this?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, we have to accept and be also transparent about uncertainty. I mean, we base our strategy on a clear analysis, how much CO2 reduction can we deliver with different options. And we rate them, obviously, by the price per ton of CO2. So we have to find the economic optimum for achieving our targets. Will this be stable? No. Will in the next years we learn over and over again that new options may become more expensive or cheaper, that things we haven't been considering as a possibility may pop up? That's absolutely certain. So navigating in this environment where what comes from the outside will influence our options and our strategies, this is what we need to do, and that means we need to work with many more partners outside in order to navigate in that environment.
Thank you very much. Now, I've taken so much from this. Thank you. I thank all of you. I mean, so many insights, so many inspirations, a very, very valuable stakeholder dialogue that shows that it is important to show leadership, to collaborate, to talk to each other, to have new ideas, to maybe also try to accept failures and keep the process going so that we can together build this more sustainable future. I thank all of you, Ajay, Imi, Stefano, for joining us today, for taking the time and giving us your insights, your opinions. And I'd like to also, of course, thank Nicole, Ralf, and Thomas for taking the time. And thank all of you for watching and commenting through our chat function. Have a great day and stay tuned, because right after this discussion, we will talk to a member of the board, Dr. Wendt, about his learnings from these discussions. Stand by, we'll see you in just a minute.